I know that it is summer, so some of you are going to have to put on your thinking caps this morning, because I want to remind you about two parts of speech that play a very large role when it comes to faith. So a metaphor is one thing that stands in for another thing. Like if you have somebody, a relationship with somebody who's really strong, sometimes you'll say they're your rock, right? Now you don't actually think that they're like granite, right? It's a way of speaking. You'll say they're a rock. It's one thing that stands in for another thing. We often talk about God as Father. In the song that we opened with today, we said, Christ our Father, or God our Father, Christ our brother, right? Those are metaphors. They stand in. It's a way of saying that in the way we are related to each other, in that way we relate to the divine, right? So one thing that stands in for another thing. A metonym is far more interesting than a metaphor. A metonym is one thing that represents the whole thing. Okay? So metaphor, one thing that represents another thing. A metonym, some of you are like, what is this, English class? Sort of. Because a metonym is one thing that stands for the whole thing. I'll give you a couple examples. If you read like old battle tales, like these epic tales, it'll say like something like, you know, the banner came over the horizon. Well, it wasn't just the flag that came over the horizon, like the whole army, right? So the banner is a metonym for the whole army. Or when it's talking about ships, it'll say like the rudder plunged deep in the ocean. But it wasn't just a rudder floating, right? It's attached to a boat. The rudder is a metonym for the whole boat, right? We do this with everything. So we'll say something like the ivory tower, right? And we know that that means like the academy. But there are very few actual ivory towers. You can't be a literalist with this stuff, right? So the ivory tower represents the academy. Or we'll say the White House. But by that we mean the government, right? It's a metonym for the whole thing. And so our Washington, D.C. is like a stand-in. It's a shortcut, right? It's a placeholder. And so these things function. So like in a romantic relationship, we'll often talk about what happens in the bedroom, right? And it's like, that's a metonym, right? Some of you are like, easy, Pastor. Easy. I know it's hot up in here, but seriously, just easy. But we do it with so many things, you know? We have one thing that stands in for the whole thing. And we do it positively and negatively. You know, I was watching a series that was set in the 50s and 60s, and they would often call women who worked there skirts, right? Like as if that's all she was, a skirt, right? But this is how language works. It's a metonym. And so when it comes to faith, I think this is really helpful for us. Because there are times where if you read, say, the sacred text, Scripture literally, it will fail you. You'll try to make something too concrete and it will crumble under your expectations. It won't hold up under any examination at all. And we're reading through Galatians this summer, and Galatians has a very key metonym built into it. So the Bible has lots of metaphors, right? Lots of things that represent another thing, right? Because that's how language works. But there are also these metonyms. So I'm going to tell you about this one in Galatians that I think is really helpful to know about. When Paul talks about the law, no one's saved by the law, he's not talking only about the 10 Commandments. He's using it like a metonym. When he says the law, he means Jewish identity. He means being faithful as the people of God. So the law is not rules. So sometimes as white folks or as Gentiles, as English speakers, we have made the law rules. And we say, you can't be saved by following rules. As if that's what Paul was arguing. Or the Bible itself is arguing. The law, in that sense, is a metonym. It's one thing that stands in for the whole thing. To Paul, the law meant belonging. As the Jewish people, it was their identity. So we actually do violence to the text at some level when we cut out this one word, law, we pull it out of its context, and then we put it into our legal understanding, and we say law are rules. We actually do violence to Paul's understanding, no one thought you could be saved by following the rules. This is about belonging. This is about identity. This is about being a part of a deeper thing called the people. For them, the people of God. So when we are reading through Galatians, I want to be really clear as we talk about this in community, that Paul is not presenting us an either-or option. Either grace or the law, but neither of the two shall meet. Because the thing that a lot of Gentile believers haven't taken the time to work through is that there's a lot of grace in the Old Testament. Like, God is really gracious with God's people in the Old Testament. Because sometimes people do this silly thing where they say, well, the Old Testament God was about rules and was very judgmental and violent, and right? But the New Testament is all love and cotton candy and snow angels, right? That's a bad either or. Because the reality is the Old Testament has lots of grace, but the New Testament has rules, expectations for holy living. So it's not an either or. So when you try to read these texts too literally, they fail. They buckle on you. They don't work. And for a lot of people, it's why they've stopped reading the Bible. It doesn't read literally. It doesn't read well. But if you know about metaphors and metonyms, a lot of the things that are said in Scripture start to make a lot more sense. That Paul is using the law as a stand-in, a placeholder for something much bigger, which is belonging and identity. Faithfulness to God by God's people. So, when we talk about this later, and we go to Galatians, I want you to know that when we talk about belonging and identity and faithfulness, we cannot afford to relegate that to the Old Testament and to the Jewish people and say that was the old covenant and now we have a new covenant. That's wrong. Because what Paul is saying is that the two are not entirely different, and that for you and I, this is still an issue of belonging and identity and faithfulness to God by God's people. We belong to God. But how we belong to God is by faithfulness, both the faithfulness of Christ and our faithfulness to Christ. And when we say, this is not like that, we miss something really vital, which is that Paul is arguing, this is sort of like this. Let's talk about how that transition happens. So, I'd like you to take a minute, and I want you to turn to one other person, largest groups of three, and I want you to see if you can find in your brain somewhere a metonym. And I want to compare notes. I want to pool our resources together. Do you have anything in your circles, in your hobbies, in your interests that's a metonym? One thing that stands in for a bigger thing, a whole thing.